Marlene and I first encountered the Vineyard almost 40 years ago now, and we love it. This is our family. People ask, why do you want to be in the Vineyard? I was just asked that the other day. I'm doing a preaching mentoring thing online, and why do you want to be in the Vineyard? And I said, oh, gosh, that's really easy. I said, there's two things. Number one, this is where I found my family. This is my home. And so why do you love your family? They're people that I have connected with over decades and built life with. But the other thing is that I believe that Vineyard has it right. I've drunk the Kool-Aid all the way down. I believe that the message of the kingdom really is the central message of the Bible. I believe that. I believe that Jesus' message and ministry was centered on the inbreaking of the kingdom of God, the future rushing into the present, and that when a movement makes the main thing, you're probably going to be pretty good. And so the message of the kingdom is capacious enough, that means big enough. What are you like? What did he say? He just broke into tongues. But vocab word, it is capacious enough. It's enormous to encompass all the things that we would want. Everything. We want to see people come to know Jesus. Fits into the kingdom. We want to do justice. It fits into the kingdom. We want racial reconciliation. It fits into the kingdom. We want minister to the poor. It fits into the kingdom. Whatever it is, because we believe that the center of the message of Jesus is, of course, to reconcile individuals to God, but the circumference is the renewal of all things. And when you realize that the message is bigger than just the salvation of individual souls, that the message involves, restoring the whole universe, then I think there's room for us. You're going to restore the universe, the little old me will fit in. Now, Phil called me and he said, I'd just like you to do just a few things while you're here. Can you speak to us about, how to address the political polarization that we're facing as a country and, just some of the racial issues and tensions in building a multi-ethnic church. And, many of us are struggling with, LGBT plus kind of things. And so if you can also address sexuality, but specifically help us as pastors to pastor through that, because we have just lots of different views in the church. Could you help us do that? And I thought, well, okay, but what will I do for the second talk? So, unless your church is incredibly homogeneous in terms of ethnicity and economics and political perspectives, the last few years have probably been challenging for you. 2020 was a perfect storm. It was just the atmospheric, pressures coming together. It created a perfect storm. Because not only did we have a police murder of another black man, this one, George Floyd, recorded on video, and then the subsequent protests. But in addition, we had just such extraordinary political polarization. And then if that wasn't enough, because every circus needs 3 rings, we also had a global pandemic for the first time in a century. And so I don't know about you, but, it was really hard to pastor, especially when you had to shut your church. And we were trying to pastor online while in at least my church now, maybe they didn't say this in the East, but we had folks coming to us saying that we were compromising because we were shutting the church. And we had some folks coming to us saying that we were trying to be woke because, like, we cared about keeping people safe. And it was challenging. And you know, I don't know how many pastors I've heard ask the question, when will we get back to normal? Is the new normal crazy? Like, is that the new normal? When will the fever break so that we bring the temperature down? And many of us are wondering, is this the new normal, that we're always going to walk around with 103.5 fever? I thought tonight what I'd like to do is just kind of set the present moment in a much larger context, because I do believe, and many of you probably have thought about this as pastors who are smart, that what we experienced in 2020 and 2021 was just an apocalyptic moment, right? It was a revelatory moment. The iceberg was growing under the surface for quite a long time. It just happened to erupt from, so that we could see it. But it didn't start in 2020, 2021. It's been growing and growing and growing. And so I'd like to talk about this cultural moment. And it's particularly been difficult for us as pastors because we know that things have been really crazy, but we also have families that we need to attend to, and we have to raise money and pay for Vineyard USA. Boo! Jay's like throwing things. Boo! Boo! But we have lots of things going on, and in addition, Sunday's coming. So no matter what else you do, I got to get ready for Sunday. And in the midst of that, we're trying to navigate this moment. How many of you, let me ask this just to bring this down, how many of you are really excited about the coming presidential campaign? How many of you just enjoy relaxing by watching the evening news? How many of you, to get yourself ready for your morning devotions, just like scrolling through your Twitter feed or X or whatever they call it now? There's a line that I heard from Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring where he says to Gandalf, I wish it need not happen in my time. So do I, said Gandalf. And so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what we do with the time that is given to us. So God has put you and me in this time to serve God's people at this moment, to reach our communities in this feverish hour. And in order to do that well, you and I need to be like the famous men of Issachar from 1 Chronicles, who understood the times and knew what needed to be done. So in this opening talk, what I'd like to do is just give us all a snapshot of this moment. I've been tremendously helped over the years by a professor of public policy from Harvard. Many of you are probably familiar with the writings of Robert Putnam. But if you're not, I just became a Robert Putnam fan, maybe 2 decades ago. And I found his stuff to be so useful. When he cites a statistic, it's a gold standard. You can take it to the bank. He's really reliable. He teaches at the Kennedy School. And in 2020, as I said, we experienced an apocalyptic moment. Everything came to the surface. It was all revealed. It was all out there. But what's been going on has been going on for more than a century. So let me just share some things, mostly from Putnam's work, and then I'm just going to apply them. And what I want you to come away with in my three talks is just a sense of empowerment again, a sense of, okay, God has given us what we need, a feeling of, I don't feel quite so overwhelmed. I want you to come away with a feeling of hope. But let me just show you something. So what Putnam says is, in virtually every trend that you can think of in terms of the social sciences, looks like an inverted U. Almost everything looks like an upside down U. And one of the fundamental ways that we've gotten into an upside down U is we've moved from I to we, that's at the top of the curve, back down to I. I to we to I, that is from radical independence to real interdependence and community in mid-20th century, peaking at about 1964, and then from 1964 on, we've slid back down to where we were at the end of the Civil War. So from Civil War all the way up to 1964 and then back down again. And you just see it everywhere, this community, the loss of community and the growth of individualism. If you are a pastor, does it seem like every other person you talk to is suffering from narcissistic personality disorder? I mean, really? Like, really? Like, how many times? I didn't think of doing this, but any of you Google narcissistic personality disorder at some point to just look at the, right? And you're like, yes. That's what I'm looking at. And 10 years ago I thought, okay, is this just the diagnosis du jour, right? If you've been pastoring as long as I have, in the early 1990s, every other person had multiple personality disorder, okay? And like, no, that's not the case. And then 15 years ago, every young person was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. But I think this one's real. Like, I really do. That the growth of narcissism, the focus on self, is so palpable in our churches and the people we're pastoring. I'll just give you one example, but I can multiply these by lots. My assistant just got divorced. She's just a lovely person and loves the Lord. Her husband, when I met him, she was in my residency program. When I met her husband, I said, hey, you've been in the church for a long time, but we've not gotten a chance to get to know one another. Tell me about yourself. And he said, well, I'm the kindest, most generous person I know. And I thought he would start laughing. And he didn't. He was serious. And I thought, wow. The reason he told her he was divorcing her was because even though she loved him, she didn't adore him. We see this me first trend in child raising right now. More and more people are choosing, as married couples, to not have kids. Now, there's legitimate reasons why couples choose. They might feel called to a childless life, but this is a global issue. That family size is shrinking, in some places almost to the vanishing point. And it's happening in every developing country. It's not, or every developed country, and many of the developing countries. You know, some try to explain it. They say, well, it's because of the economic pressures that right now to try to live a middle-class life requires two incomes, and that's true in part. But what sociologists have found is that actually prosperity and rising prosperity leads to much smaller families or the desire for childlessness. Now, again, there's some explanations for that. We don't need as many children to provide for us as our Social Security. And, you know, we have better contraceptives and all of that, but there's something more fundamental. That is that many people say, I don't want children because I want to spend my money on me. I want nicer vacations and better restaurants and nicer houses and more freedom. And even when the government offers really generous allowances and they're trying to move the needle so that the birth rate will increase in places like France and Italy and Spain and even in China, government policy is not moving the needle at all. People are saying, no, I do not want more children. There is really a growing narcissism that's at the core. I to we to I. And we see this inverted you, this upside down you in institutional life. What do I mean? There's a wonderful social critic named Yuval Levin. I don't know if any of you have read anything by Yuval Levin. Israeli-born Jew, moved to the United States. Brilliant writer if you ever come upon him. He wrote a book a few years ago entitled A Time to Build from Family and Community to Congress and the Campus. And anyway, one of the things that Yuval Levin pointed out in this book is that it used to be 50 years ago and before that institutions shaped individuals. That if you joined an institution, that institution formed you. They used to talk about such things as being a Harvard man. And the idea was that if you went to Harvard, you were shaped by Harvard. And if you went to Morehouse, you were a Morehouse man. You were shaped by that. It used to be that when somebody joined Congress, Congress shaped them. So that over a period of time, they got formed by being part of the institution. I grew up at a time when you knew that somebody was working for IBM. You know, they had the standard issue gray suit and the white shirt and the nondescript tie. They looked like IBM employees. What Yuval Levin points out is that in the last 50 years, more and more, institutions do not shape individuals. Rather, individuals use institutions as platforms to promote their own brand. And that's everywhere. Just think about this with me. Which Congress people do you know? Who gets to speak on the evening news shows or on podcasts? Is it the folks who are working behind the scenes to create policies that would better the lives of Americans? Or is it the folks that are talking about Jewish space lasers? Or sending out Christmas cards with their kids holding assault rifles? And they're talking about if Jesus had an assault rifle, he wouldn't be put on a cross. Now that's real. It's not Congress that's shaping individuals. It's individuals who use Congress to promote their brand. But it's not just in politics, and it's not just in corporate life. This is what's happening in the church. It used to be when people joined a church and pastored in that church, the denomination, the church affiliation shaped the pastor. But more and more, we are familiar with celebrity pastors. but we don't really know, like, what church are they part of? What broader association? We just don't remember that because the pastor is the brand, not the association or the denomination. So in every area of life, we're seeing this inverted U. And we certainly see this inverted U regarding economic inequality. And just one other graph of Putnam here. Let me just give you some stats. We're trying to put us in this moment. The top 10% of wage earners now control 74% of America's wealth. Top 10, 74%. The next 40% control 24%. It's down from a third 30 years ago. The bottom 50% of Americans control 2% of America's income. Okay? Half of Americans control just 2% of the income. Now it gets even more extreme. Let me just run these stats out for you. The top 1/10 of 1% owns 20% of the household wealth in America. 0.1%, 20%. The top 1% owns 2 times the wealth of the bottom 90%. And if you look at inflation-adjusted income over the last 4 decades, it's fallen, let's see here, $320 for the bottom 10%. It rose $388 for those at 20%. It rose $5,200 for those at the national medium. It rose $75,000 for the top 5%. It rose, $929,000 for the top 1%. And it rose $4.8 million for the top 1/10 of 1%. And so it's not just imaginary that the pie is being divided more and more or going more and more to fewer and fewer people. And the growth of income inequality doesn't bode well for us. If you look at history, the more a society becomes increasingly unequal, the more tensions there will be in that society. We have lots and lots of history behind that. The revolutions in Europe came out of this great income inequality. And so some societies become less and less stable. And part of the reason for the growing inequality is not just globalization. It's not just technological change. It is that. But there is a growing narcissism. There are more and more folks who believe that not only do I deserve a larger share of the pie because I've worked harder, I have a better education, I'm contributing more to lots of other people, so I deserve more, which most people would say you absolutely do. But more and more folks say not only that, I deserve 1,000 times more. I deserve 100,000 times more. And income inequality is not just destabilizing. It has real-world consequences. There are 2 economists that tracked over the last 20 years the growth of deaths of despair. You've probably heard of that. Deaths of despair. That what's happening for the first time in a century is that American life expectancies are going down. And that's not just the result of COVID. That life expectancy is going down because of the rise of deaths by opioids, and deaths by suicide, and deaths by alcoholism. And that started in the white working class. They began seeing this trend in 2010, that the white working class males' life expectancy was going down for the first time since the 1930s. But now it's affecting all races. And so we're in this weird time of medical advances and lowering life expectancy. What does that say about a society? And the pressure is building not only in America but across the globe. lots of unhappiness, lots of income inequality, lots of family breakdown, lots of narcissism, and it's resulting in political polarization. And it's not a myth. I listen to podcasts who say, oh, political polarization, you don't know what it was like to grow up in the 60s. Yes, I do. I grew up in the 60s. And I was marching. I really was. This is different. This is really different. The statistics are clear. We are experiencing an inverted U regarding our political connectedness. Let me just give you one really simple illustration of how polarized we are. If you go back to 1947, mid-century in the 20th century, and you look at the presidential approval ratings of then Democratic President Harry Truman, 60% of Democrats in 1947 approved of the job that Harry Truman was doing. But 40% of the Republicans approved of the job that Harry Truman was doing. There was a 20-point gap. As you would expect, the other party generally doesn't like, the other party's candidate, right? But still, 20-point gap. As late as the early 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was the president, 2/3 of Republicans approved of Reagan's performance. But 1/3 of Democrats approved of Ronald Reagan's performance. There was a 30-point gap. In the last 10 years, the gap has grown to over 90 points. Under Obama and under Trump, virtually the entire political party represented by that person approved of their performance, and virtually none of the opposition party approved of them. And so the polarization has really grown where there's no overlap in terms of the way that we see the other side. And it's showing up everywhere. For the first time in American history, the divide right now, the biggest divide, is not race, and it's not religion. It's politics. It's politics. They've surveyed folks, and folks would much rather their children marry someone of a different race, even a different religion, but not a different political party. Because folks no longer just disagree with your politics. They think that someone of the opposite party is a bad person, that they're evil, they're personally immoral, that we're experiencing right now what one sociologist called the big sort. Folks are choosing where to live based on the political opinions of their neighbors. And this isn't just a zip code issue. This is a church issue. Because folks are increasingly choosing their churches based upon the perceived political posture of the pastor and the church. Folks are sorting themselves by, do I agree with what I'm hearing from the pulpit? I've been pastoring long enough to remember folks disagreeing with what they were hearing and still staying in the church and loving me. That's no longer the case. Folks are leaving when they hear something they disagree with, and they're being told by people, when you leave, leave loudly. Make sure you leave, and you leave loudly. And so we're thrown into this moment as pastors where we're called to bring people together, and yet folks are sorting themselves in all these different ways. We have all of this pressure. Think about it. Economic inequality and political polarization. And then we have the macro trend of the massive de-churching of America. Robert Putnam, his statistics say that the evangelical boom that we began to experience in the 1970s pretty much began petering out by the early 1990s. And more, we're starting to see people leave the church. In terms of church affiliation, over the last 20 years, Americans went from being affiliated at a rate of 68% to down to 48%. There's been a 20-point drop in 20 years. So, we're seeing people get angrier and angrier. If we watch the trend lines, not just above the surface, but what's been going on below the surface, we want to say like Frodo, I wish it didn't happen in my time. And we need to listen to the wisdom of Gandalf, who said, so do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for us to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that's given us. Now, at this point, many of you are saying, Phil, why did you invite Rich? Because did you just invite him to depress us with bad news? And I didn't talk about all of the other dislocations that we're experiencing, the technological changes with AI and climate change, and then, the various wars. And, we can just keep adding dislocation after dislocation, declining church attendance in many places. I was on a Zoom call a few years ago with Robert Putnam. And I'm on the board for the NAE, and we had Robert Putnam, and some of the pastors, he was going through a lot of the data, and one of the pastors just said, well, Dr. Putnam, what do you think we ought to do in light of all of this? And Robert Putnam is a convert to Judaism, and he just laughed. He said, I don't know. I thought you pastors would know. If you pastors don't know, how would I know? He was saying something that was absolutely on the money. Because, here's what I want to do. I want to close tonight, and then in the next two talks, with words of hope. Because, you see, I really believe, that we pastors and our churches have exactly the answers that our country, our world needs at this particular feverish time. That we may not be aware of it, but we have the resources. And we just need to have confidence that, yes, we do have the resources. Because the answers for what we're struggling with as a society are not primarily technological. The solutions are not to be found in technology. And the solutions are not to be found in politics. That's not where we're going to find answers for this broken world. The issues are not primarily economic. But Christianity has the resources. And we pastors have the resources. And we have what no one else in our community has. So, like what? Well, I want to mention one resource tonight. And then over the next 2 days, I'm going to mention 6 others. But the resource that I believe we have is the resource of community. Do you know how America in the past went from an I society to a we society? How did we go from radical individualism to radical interdependence? You see, we had the same economic inequality following the Civil War. We had the same levels of political polarization immediately after the Civil War. We had the same amounts of, not only political divisions, but political corruption. Elections were bought and sold. And we had unbelievable amounts of social change happening following the Civil War. Plus, lots of ethnic and racial divide. We had the birth of Jim Crow and millions of immigrants coming into the United States, plus lots of social change as people were moving from farms to the city. And what you might not know is at the beginning of the 20th century, church-going rates were unbelievably low. Most people were not associated with a church. So what happened? What happened to bring society together so that America was like healed? There was a we sense. Churches all across America began to build community. And that's what we have. Churches have the capacity to build community like no one else. Let me read to you from one religious historian. Here's what he said about churches in the beginning of the 20th century. He said, thousands of congregations transformed themselves into centers that not only were open for worship, but were also available for Sunday school, concerts, church socials, women's meetings, youth groups, girls' guilds, boys' brigades, sewing circles, benevolent societies, day schools, temperance societies, athletic clubs, scout troops, and nameless other activities. Henry Ward Beecher advised the seminarians at Yale to multiply picnics in their churches. And many congregations not only multiplied picnics, but they went beyond picnics. And they started gymnasiums and parish houses and camps and basketball teams and baseball teams and military drill groups. And churches did everything and anything they could do to build community, to build social cohesion. That's what churches did. And as those relationships deepened because of the church, our society moved from an I world to a we world. And this was particularly true in the black church. Here's what one prominent African American church historian said. The black church housed a variety of programs, schools, circulating libraries, concerts, insurance companies, restaurants, vocational training, women's conferences, and graduations. What if every single one of us as pastors went back to our leadership team and said, look, we're doing a lot to try to build community in our local church. But here's what I'd like to do. I'd like us to pray and come up with 5 fresh ways in our church, 5 fresh ways that we could build community in this next year. What could we do to bring people in our church together? What would that look like? And what if we didn't only try to build community in our church, but what if we started to preach community more than we are? Because, listen, most of the time when we preach, the grid that we're using has been shaped by the radical individualism of American society. We're constantly asking the question, what does this text mean for you? How can we benefit you? What are the takeaways for you as an individual? How could you and your life be better as a result of what you're hearing today? Well, what if we began to shift the emphasis of our sermons so that we not only land on the individual, but we said, what does this text mean for us as the people of God? Listen, God's word is not just designed to form individuals, it's designed to form us into the people of God, to make us into the family of God, to build up the body of Christ, and to cause us to live as the church of the living God. A few months ago, I bought and read, if you haven't read this, Scott McKnight has a wonderful little commentary on the book of Romans. Any of you reading Romans backward? Have any of you come upon that book? Wow, that's quite a lot. No comment. But for those of you who are preachers, how many of you preach on a sometimes basis? Okay, yeah. And if you still occasionally preach through books of the Bible, well, folks do everything. But if you occasionally preach through books of the Bible, maybe you've preached through the book of Romans, and you know the typical way that people preach through the book of Romans. Romans 1 to 3 is a diagnosis of the problem, right? And so Romans 1, we have the problem of immoral Gentiles. And Romans 2, we have the problem of moral Gentiles. And Romans 3, we have the problem of the Jews. And so we've got the diagnosis of the problem. And then in Romans 4 and 5, we have the solution to the problem, which is justification by faith. And then Romans 6 and 7, we have, the way that we individuals become sanctified. And Romans 8, it's the way we're glorified. And Romans 9 to 11 is a kind of parenthesis. Paul is talking about Jews and Gentiles. It's not terribly relevant for us today, but Paul was into that stuff. And so, maybe there's some connection between the regathering of the Jewish people in the land of Israel and the return of Christ, and maybe I can work a creative sermon out of that. But we basically skip it, and we get to Romans 12, and that's personal ethics. And so from Romans 12 to Romans 16, we have a kind of a grab bag of personal ethics. He's talking about body life, and then he talks about our relationship to the state, and then he talks about something about vegetables and meat and like that, and people are fighting about that, and then we end the book. And I usually don't get that far because I just usually end at Romans 8. Okay. And so that's kind of the way we preach. Or that's typical American preaching anyway, isn't it? It's just focus on the individual. How does the book of Romans save you? But what Scott McKnight suggests is instead of starting at the beginning, we start at the end. We start at Romans 14 to 16, and we read Romans backwards. And if you start at 14 to 16, you realize that the whole book of Romans is about broken community. It's about the weak who are Torah-observant Jews, and they're looking down, they're Torah-observant Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but they also believe that the way that your life is going to be transformed is you need to observe the Torah. And they're looking down on the Gentiles in the congregation, and they're saying, you're not Torah observant, so you're not going to be transformed. They are the weak. And then there are the strong, who are mainly Gentiles, who are saying, you know what? We don't have to observe the Torah. And they judge the weak because the weak are still observing the Torah, and there's this division. And the entire book of Romans is designed to heal community. What if, when we were preaching texts, we said to ourselves, the moment we're living in is a moment of broken community. And I'm not going to preach this message unless I think through the community implications of this text, and it doesn't just land for individuals. What if we started to read the New Testament the way the New Testament was designed to be preached, which is all about community? The book of Galatians is not just about law and grace. It's about the healing of divisions between Jews and those who rejected Torah observance. The book of Philippians is about the healing of relationship. 1 Corinthians is largely about divisions in the church. And we see those divisions in the church in the book of Philemon. We see the same thing in, where else? Really, yeah. I mean, we see divisions in 1 Timothy. We see divisions in Titus. What if we just kept trying to build community, but we also regularly preached community so that people came away more and more with a corporate sense? Not just that it's me and Jesus, but it's me in the company of the people of God and Jesus. So listen, let me close with a couple of thoughts. You know, yesterday when I was preaching at Phil's church, I was preaching out of John 15, the story of the vine and the branches. And it struck me as I was preparing for the message at our own church just a couple of weeks ago that the thing that Jesus says most often on the night before he goes to the cross is, love one another. Of all the things Jesus could have said right before he goes to the cross, he says, love one another. And that's really interesting, you know, that this is so fundamental. The last words I want to leave you is, love each other. We do live at a time where people have fallen out of love with church. And we need to communicate to people that, you know what? There is no place in our society right now that you will get what you will get in church. Like literally no place. That if you think you can be a good person outside of church, let's be honest with each other. Where outside of church does anyone ever challenge you to not be self-indulgent? Anywhere. Where do you ever hear someone say no to yourself? Where outside of church are we ever encouraged towards humility? Where outside of church are we ever challenged to forgive everyone for everything? Where outside of church are we called to keep our commitments in marriage? To not just indulge ourselves, but like keep covenant. And where outside of church are we ever called upon to love every other member of the family of God? Like nowhere. We need church. But I finish with this. It's not only the people in our church that need church. It's not only that we pastors need to build community and preach community. We pastors need the church. You know, I did talk about why we, what we need to say to our churches. But we pastors need to preach to ourselves. And I don't know about you, but during the last few years, I know many pastors who have been tempted to give up on the church. And maybe some of you have been tempted to just say, I don't know how long I can do this thing called church. But lots of people have given up on the church. Maybe they didn't give up on their church, they loved their church. But the big church, Big C church, we don't like that very much. And if we're brutally honest, we would say that Jesus' bride hasn't looked very pretty over the last few years. There's a book that I've read 4 times in the last decade. It's a book by a guy named Mark Thibodeau. You could even write this down. It's a wonderful book. It's called God's Voice Within. And if you know anyone or you're going through a period of discernment where you're trying to figure out what is God saying to me at this moment, what is the call on my life, I would recommend God's Voice Within. It's really helpful in seeking discernment. But I'll close with what Mark Thibodeau writes about his own need for the church. And here's what he says. He says, when I am in desolation and I am seeking wisdom, I can rely on my own decades of reflection and prayer alone, or I can learn from thousands of years of prayer, reflection, debate, moral victories, and yes, moral failures too. Why on earth would I want to pass up such a treasury of wisdom? From Augustine, I've learned about surrendering to God's will and forsaking my own hedonistic urgings. From Teresa of Avila, I've learned the subtleties, complexities, and ecstasies of contemplative prayer. From Benedict, I learned about hospitality. And from John the 23rd, the courage to remake myself. From Mary, I learned to trust in providence. And from Maximilian Kolbe, I learned about sacrifice. From Francis of Assisi, I learned about Lady Poverty. And from Francis Xavier, I learn about passion for evangelization. The church is the spiritual refuge for battle-weary souls. I attend church to pray with people who have the same desires and insipid temptations as I. Together as one family, we lift our prayers to the Father and we beg the Son to come close, to teach us, to heal us, to redeem us, and to befriend us. When I feel lost, confused, and frightened, the ritual of the church nourishes and strengthens me in a place too deep for words. And I would add, from John Wimber, I learned about the power of the kingdom and the need to take risks. From Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, I learned how to love to preach. From John Stott, I learned how to love the Scripture. From Jim Elliot, I learned about giving my all to Jesus Christ. From Martin Luther King Jr., I learned about the power of nonviolence. And from my wife Marlene, I learned about what love and faithfulness looks like over the course of 50 years. Brothers and sisters, you and I need the church. We need the church. And I felt led to end this talk with just a word to pastors. More than anyone else in our congregations, we ought to be convicted about our need for the church more than anyone in our congregations. We ought to love the church that we're serving.